I heard her laugh before I heard the words, and somehow that made it worse. "This is Margaret," my daughter-in-law said, lifting her champagne glass slightly as if presenting something amusing, "our leech maid." A few people chuckled politely, the kind of soft laughter that floats through expensive rooms without ever landing anywhere real, and I stood there beneath the crystal lights of the Whitmore Industries annual gala, holding my own glass steady, as if the words hadn't just been placed carefully at my feet for everyone to step over. I smiled because that is what I have always done best, and I nodded to the men and women in tailored suits who suddenly seemed unsure whether to meet my eyes or look away. The ballroom was everything Daniel had promised it would be. Polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, a string quartet tucked into the corner playing something soft and forgettable, but the air felt different now, thinner somehow, as if the room itself had shifted to accommodate a version of me I did not recognize. I watched Olivia move effortlessly from group to group, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, her voice carrying just enough to be heard, just enough to remind everyone who she believed she was in this company. My son followed her lead as he always did these days, smiling when she smiled, laughing when she laughed, never once glancing back at me. That, more than anything, settled something quiet and final inside my chest. There was a time when Daniel would have corrected her, gently but firmly, the way his father used to correct a misplaced fact at the dinner table, but that version of my son seemed to belong to another life entirely, one that had ended the day we buried Edward. I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the dryness linger, and turned slightly as I noticed a man across the room who was not laughing. He stood near the edge of the crowd, his expression carefully neutral, his eyes fixed on Olivia in a way that suggested recognition rather than amusement. Harrison Cole had been with the company longer than anyone in that room cared to remember, longer even than some of the stories Olivia liked to tell about its beginnings, and for a brief moment our eyes met. He gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible but enough to remind me that not everything had been rewritten, not everything had been forgotten. I set my glass down on a passing tray and smoothed the sleeve of my navy dress, the same shade Edward used to say made me look formidable, though he always said it with a smile. Around me the conversations resumed their usual rhythm, deals being discussed, futures being planned, all of it unfolding on a foundation I knew more intimately than anyone in that room, including the woman who had just introduced me as if I were something borrowed and disposable. I let Olivia have her moment, let the room settle into the version of reality she had so carefully constructed, because there is a certain kind of power in being underestimated, a quiet advantage that only reveals itself when it is far too late to correct the mistake. And as I stood there unnoticed once more, I realized that tonight was not the night I would remind them who I was. Tonight, I would simply watch and remember exactly who they had chosen to believe I wasn't. I moved slowly through the room after that, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see everything, every glance, every hesitation, every carefully measured smile that followed Olivia's introduction. It is remarkable how quickly people adjust their behavior once they are given a label to work with. A few minutes earlier, I had been invisible in the way older women often are at events like this, politely acknowledged and then set aside. Now I was something else entirely, something vaguely amusing, something to be categorized and dismissed. A young woman in a silver dress offered me a tight smile as she passed, her eyes flickering down to my hands as if expecting to see a tray or a clipboard. I returned the smile, just as polite, just as empty, and continued on. Near the bar, two men lowered their voices when I approached, though not quite enough to hide the last few words. "Family obligation, I guess," one of them murmured, and the other gave a small shrug. I did not stop. I did not correct them. I simply noted it, the way I used to note small discrepancies in ledgers when Edward and I were first building the company, long before there were accountants and advisors and layers of management to filter everything into something clean and presentable. Back then, nothing was hidden because nothing could be afforded to be hidden. We knew every dollar, every risk, every late night that turned into an early morning. I could still see that old garage if I closed my eyes, the single overhead light, the folding table that served as a desk, the smell of motor oil lingering from the previous tenant. Edward had believed in the idea with a kind of quiet certainty that never needed to be announced, and I had believed in him. That was enough. I reached the far side of the ballroom where the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, the city lights reflecting back at me in fractured patterns. For a moment, I stood there and let the noise of the party fade into something distant and indistinct. In the reflection, I saw a woman in a well-fitted navy dress, her posture straight, her expression calm, and I wondered what Olivia saw when she looked at me. A burden, perhaps. An inconvenience. Something left over from a past she did not care to understand. Behind me, I could hear her voice again, bright and confident, explaining some future expansion plan to a group of potential partners, her tone carrying the easy authority of someone who has never been challenged in a room like this. Daniel's voice followed, softer, agreeing, reinforcing, always just a step behind hers. I turned slightly, just enough to watch them without being obvious about it. There was a rhythm to the way they moved together now, a practice performance that suggested this was not the first time she had spoken for both of them. And yet, as I listened more closely, I noticed something else beneath the surface, a hesitation from the older executives, a careful choice of words, as if they were navigating around something unspoken. That was when Harrison Cole appeared at my side, his presence as steady as I remembered, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond us. "You handled that introduction with remarkable composure," he said, not looking at me directly but out at the city beyond the glass. I allowed myself the faintest hint of a smile. "Composure has its uses," I replied. He inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a point already understood. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke, and then he added, almost as an afterthought, "There are documents that have not been revisited in quite some time. It might be worth your attention." I did not ask what he meant. I did not need to. Instead, I let his words settle, fitting into place with a precision that felt almost inevitable. Across the room, Olivia raised her glass again, drawing attention, commanding the space as if it already belonged to her. I watched her, and for the first time that evening I felt something shift, not in anger, not even in hurt, but in clarity. People often believe that power is something loud, something that needs to be displayed and reinforced at every opportunity. They mistake attention for authority, volume for control. Edward had never made that mistake, and neither had I. I turned back to the window, my reflection steady, unchanged, and realized that everything I needed had been there all along, quietly waiting just like me. I remained by the window for a while after Harrison stepped away, letting the quiet settle around me like a familiar coat, the kind you forget you are wearing until you realize how well it fits. Across the room, Olivia's voice grew more animated as she guided a small circle of investors through her version of the company's future, her hand moving in smooth, confident gestures as if she were outlining something she had built herself. Daniel stood beside her, nodding at the right moments, repeating key phrases, reinforcing her narrative in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. It was not anger I felt as I watched them, but something far more useful, a slow and steady understanding that had been forming long before tonight, now finally clear enough to act upon. I moved away from the glass and took a path along the edge of the room, careful to stay just outside the center of attention, where conversations are less guarded and truths slip through more easily. Near one of the tall cocktail tables, I overheard a senior manager speaking in a low voice to a colleague, something about pending approvals and final authority, words that carried weight even when spoken casually. The colleague responded with a glance toward Olivia, followed by a slight shake of the head, as if there were limits she did not fully understand. I continued walking, each small detail adding itself to a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. At another table, a group of younger employees discussed the expansion plan with a kind of cautious enthusiasm, repeating Olivia's phrases almost word for word, but with an undercurrent of uncertainty that suggested they were waiting for something more concrete, something official. It was a feeling I recognized well from the early days, when decisions mattered because they determined whether we could keep the lights on for another month. That kind of uncertainty never truly disappears, no matter how polished the surface becomes. As I reached the far side of the room, I noticed Harrison again, this time speaking quietly with one of the board members, his posture relaxed but his expression intent. He did not look in my direction, but there was a subtle shift in the conversation when I passed, a pause that suggested my presence was not as unnoticed as Olivia believed. I stopped briefly at an empty table and rested my fingertips against the cool surface, grounding myself in the moment. The music had changed to something slightly more upbeat, the rhythm filling the spaces between conversations, giving the evening a sense of forward motion that felt almost ironic. Everything appeared to be moving ahead exactly as planned, at least from Olivia's perspective. She laughed again, louder this time, drawing attention as she raised her glass once more, preparing to make some kind of announcement. I could see the anticipation in the room, the way people leaned in just slightly, ready to listen, ready to accept whatever version of reality she was about to present. Daniel adjusted his jacket and stepped closer to her, his expression composed, his role clearly defined. For a moment I allowed myself to remember another gathering years ago, when Edward had stood in a much smaller room and spoken about possibilities that seemed almost unrealistic at the time. He had not needed to raise his voice to be heard. He had simply told the truth as he saw it, and that had been enough. I straightened my shoulders and drew in a slow breath, feeling the weight of the evening settle into something steady and controlled. The difference between then and now was not the scale of the room or the number of people listening. It was the understanding of who truly held the authority to decide what happened next. Olivia lifted her glass higher, her voice beginning to rise above the music, and in that moment I knew the timing had arrived, not because I was ready to speak, but because she was ready to be heard, and that, more than anything else, would make what came next impossible to ignore. Olivia's voice cut cleanly through the room as she began to speak, confident and practiced, drawing every eye toward her without effort, and I remained exactly where I was, just beyond the center, where I could see everything without being expected to react. She spoke about growth, about expansion into new markets, about bold decisions and visionary leadership, each phrase polished and familiar. The kind of language that sounds impressive until you realize it says very little. The audience responded the way audiences always do, with nods and attentive expressions, with quiet murmurs of approval that fed her rhythm and encouraged her to continue. Daniel stood beside her, his posture straight, his face composed, and for a moment I searched his expression for something that might resemble recognition, some small flicker that he understood the foundation beneath the words being spoken, but there was nothing there except agreement, steady and unquestioning. I felt a memory rise then, uninvited but clear, of a much smaller room with uneven flooring and a single window that barely let in enough light to work by, where Edward had stood with his sleeves rolled up and a pencil tucked behind his ear, explaining numbers to me that did not yet mean anything to anyone else. We had sat at a folding table, papers spread out in careful stacks, calculating risks that could have taken everything we had if they went wrong, and I remembered the moment he had paused, looked at me, and said that if we were going to build something that lasted, it had to be protected from the very beginning. I had not understood the full weight of those words at the time, but I had trusted him, just as he had trusted me when he placed the first set of documents in front of me and asked me to sign. Not because I was convenient, but because he believed I would never forget what those signatures meant. Back in the present, Olivia continued speaking, her voice rising slightly as she reached what she clearly considered the most important part of her announcement, outlining a new partnership that would, in her words, redefine the direction of the company. There was a shift in the room then, subtle but unmistakable, as some of the older executives exchanged brief glances, the kind that carry entire conversations without a single word being spoken. Harrison Cole stood near the edge of the group, his hands loosely clasped, his attention fixed not on Olivia but on the reactions around her, as if measuring something invisible. I took a step forward, then another, moving slowly but with purpose, my heels making a soft, steady sound against the polished floor that seemed louder to me than it could possibly be to anyone else. Olivia did not notice at first, too focused on her own momentum, too certain of her place at the center of the room, and Daniel followed her lead as he always did, unaware of the shift that had already begun. I felt no rush, no urgency, only a calm certainty that had settled into place with each passing moment, built from years of watching, of listening, of understanding when to speak and when to remain silent. The documents Harrison had mentioned earlier were not just papers filed away and forgotten. They were decisions, deliberate and final, made at a time when every choice mattered, when the future of everything we had worked for depended on getting those details exactly right. Olivia's voice reached its peak as she lifted her glass again, inviting the room to share in her vision, to accept her authority as something already established, something unquestionable. That was when I reached the edge of the circle, close enough now that I could see the slight tightening at the corner of Harrison's eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his stance as he recognized what was about to happen. I did not interrupt her immediately. I waited just long enough for the room to settle into the silence that follows expectation, the moment when everyone is ready to listen, and then I raised my hand slightly, not high, not dramatic, just enough to be seen by the one person who needed to notice first. Harrison stepped forward without hesitation, his voice calm and clear as he addressed the room, and in that instant every carefully constructed assumption began to falter, not because I had said anything yet, but because the space itself was preparing to hear something it had not been expecting at all. Harrison's voice did not rise, but it carried in a way that made people stop speaking without realizing why. A quiet authority that did not need to demand attention because it had already earned it. "Before any formal announcements are made," he said, his tone even, almost conversational, "there is a procedural matter that should be addressed." Olivia paused mid-sentence, the smile still fixed in place but no longer as natural as it had been a moment ago, her eyes shifting toward him with the faintest hint of irritation. This was not part of her plan. That much was clear. Daniel glanced between them, uncertain for the first time that evening, his confidence faltering just enough to be noticed by those who knew how to look for it. The room adjusted in response, conversations fading, attention narrowing, the air tightening with a kind of anticipation that had nothing to do with Olivia's prepared remarks. I stepped forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, simply moving into the space that had opened without being asked, my presence acknowledged now in a way it had not been before. Olivia's expression flickered as she finally turned toward me fully, her smile thinning, recalibrating, searching for the version of me she believed she understood. "Margaret," she said lightly, as if including me in the moment out of politeness, "we are just about to share some exciting news." I inclined my head slightly, the gesture calm, deliberate, and waited until the last murmur in the room had settled into silence. "I am aware," I said, my voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the circle without strain. There was a shift then, subtle but undeniable, as several of the older executives straightened, their attention sharpening, as if a different kind of meeting had just begun without anyone announcing it. Harrison remained at my side, his presence unobtrusive but firm, and I could feel the weight of his earlier words settling into place with quiet precision. Olivia let out a soft laugh, attempting to reclaim the moment, her tone bright but edged now with something tighter. "Well, I think everyone will be very pleased with what we have planned," she said, turning slightly back toward the group as if to continue. "I am sure they will," I replied, not raising my voice, not interrupting but continuing just enough that the room remained with me instead of her. Daniel's gaze shifted to me then, really looking at me for the first time that evening, and I saw something there I had not seen in a long time, not recognition exactly but uncertainty, the kind that comes when a familiar narrative begins to unravel. I reached into my evening bag, my movements unhurried, and withdrew a single folded document, the paper worn just enough at the edges to show it had not been filed away and forgotten, but kept, revisited, remembered. I did not hold it up immediately. I let it rest in my hand, visible but unexplained, allowing the silence to deepen, to stretch just long enough that curiosity began to replace assumption. "There is something I have learned over the years," I said, my gaze moving briefly across the faces in front of me, not seeking approval, not asking for permission, simply acknowledging their presence. "People tend to believe that what is not spoken no longer exists." Olivia's smile had faded now, replaced by a stillness that felt more calculated, her posture straightening as she tried to regain control of a situation she could no longer fully predict. Daniel took a half step forward, as if to say something but stopped, his hesitation more revealing than any words could have been. I unfolded the document slowly, the soft sound of paper shifting carrying farther than it should have in the quiet room, and for a moment, I allowed myself to remember the day it had first been signed, the weight of the pen in my hand, Edward's steady presence beside me, the understanding that some decisions are meant to outlast the moment in which they are made. I looked up then, meeting Olivia's eyes directly, and spoke with the same calm certainty that had guided every choice that mattered. "Before any future is decided," I said, "it is important to be clear about who has the authority to decide it." The words did not need emphasis. They settled into the room on their own, precise and unyielding, and in the silence that followed I could see it begin, the first real crack in the version of reality Olivia had been so certain she controlled. No one spoke immediately after that, and in that silence something fundamental shifted in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet. way that truth has of rearranging everything without asking permission. Olivia's composure held for a moment longer, her chin lifting slightly as if she could still steer the direction of the evening back to where she wanted it, but the confidence behind it had thinned, replaced by calculation. "I am not sure what you mean," she said, her tone controlled, though the edge beneath it was no longer hidden. I did not answer her right away. Instead, I let the document in my hands become the focal point, allowing the weight of it to settle over the room before I spoke again. Harrison stepped forward then, just enough to stand clearly within the circle, his presence no longer peripheral. "For clarity," he said, his voice steady and precise, "the document Mrs. Whitmore is referencing is the original shareholder agreement, filed at the time of the company's incorporation and reaffirmed in subsequent legal reviews." A murmur moved through the group, subtle but unmistakable, as several of the older board members exchanged looks that confirmed recognition rather than surprise. Olivia's eyes flickered toward Daniel, searching perhaps for reassurance or contradiction, but he remained still, his expression tightening as he tried to follow a conversation he had never fully been part of. I unfolded the document completely now, the paper catching the light just enough for those closest to see the signatures at the bottom. The ink faded slightly with time but no less binding. "My husband believed in protecting what we built," I said, my voice calm, carrying without force. "He believed that ownership should remain with the person who would remember how it started." I did not need to explain further. The meaning was already there, written in ink long before this evening, long before Olivia had ever stepped into this world and begun shaping it into something more convenient for herself. One of the senior executives cleared his throat softly, a small sound that carried more weight than it should have. "If I recall correctly," he said, addressing no one in particular but speaking for everyone who needed to hear it, "the majority stake was never transferred." Harrison inclined his head slightly. "That is correct." The words settled heavily, not because they were loud but because they were final. Olivia's smile disappeared entirely then, replaced by a stillness that felt almost rigid, as if she were holding herself together through sheer force of will. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, though the confidence she tried to project no longer matched the reality unfolding around her. I met her gaze evenly, without hostility, without triumph, simply with the same clarity that had carried me through every decision that mattered. "There is no misunderstanding," I replied. Daniel took a step forward at last, his voice uncertain as he spoke my name, as if testing whether I would respond the way I always had before. I did not look at him immediately. Instead, I allowed the silence to extend just long enough for him to feel it, to recognize that something had changed in a way he could not undo with a single word. When I finally turned to him, my expression remained calm, but there was no softness left in it. "This was never about being seen," I said quietly. "It was about being understood." Around us, the room had gone completely still, the earlier laughter and easy conversation replaced by something far more attentive, far more real. People were no longer watching Olivia. They were watching me. And for the first time that evening, I did not step back from that attention. I let it settle where it belonged, not as something to display, but as something that had always been there, waiting for the moment it was finally acknowledged. Daniel's voice lingered in the air after he spoke my name, but it no longer carried the same weight it once had, no longer held the quiet authority of a son who understood where he came from, and I could see it in the way he hesitated, the way his next words failed to form as easily as they should have. Olivia stepped in before he could recover, her posture straightening, her expression sharpening into something more deliberate, more controlled, as if she believed she could still reshape the narrative by sheer force of presence. "Even if that were true," she said, her tone measured but tight, "this company has evolved far beyond its original structure. Decisions are made based on current leadership, not outdated paperwork." A few heads in the room turned at that, not in agreement, but in careful consideration, as if weighing the statement against something they already knew. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I folded the document once more with slow precision, the sound of the paper soft but distinct in the quiet room, and placed it back into my bag. The gesture was simple, almost understated, but it shifted something again, because it signaled that I did not need to prove anything further in that moment. Harrison spoke before the silence could stretch too far. "Corporate governance does not operate on perception," he said calmly. It operates on legal standing. And that standing has not changed. Olivia's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in her composure that she could not fully conceal, and for a brief moment, her eyes moved across the faces around her, searching for support, for validation, for someone willing to reinforce the version of reality she had been presenting all evening. What she found instead was distance. Not hostility, not rejection, but a careful stepping back, the kind that happens when people realize they may have aligned themselves too quickly with the wrong assumption. Daniel shifted his weight, his hands no longer steady at his sides, and when he looked at me again, there was something new in his expression, something closer to recognition, but layered with uncertainty, as if he were seeing pieces of a story he had never been told. "Why was I not aware of this?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the confidence he had borrowed earlier in the evening. I held his gaze for a moment, not with accusation, but with a quiet steadiness that left no room for deflection. "Because you did not ask," I said simply. The words were not harsh, but they settled heavily, carrying more truth than explanation ever could. Around us, the room remained still, the earlier energy of the gala replaced by something more deliberate, more attentive, as if every person present understood that they were witnessing a shift that extended far beyond a single conversation. Olivia let out a short breath, a controlled exhale that suggested she was recalibrating, searching for a way to regain control of a situation that was no longer hers to command. "This is not the time or place for this discussion," she said, her tone firm, attempting to close the moment, to push it aside as something inappropriate, something that could be handled privately. I considered that for a brief second, not because I agreed but because it revealed exactly what she needed now: distance, time, space to rebuild. The version of events she had been constructing. I did not give her that. "This is exactly the time," I replied, my voice even unhurried. "Because this is where the decisions are being presented." Harrison nodded almost imperceptibly, and one of the board members stepped forward slightly, his presence reinforcing the shift that had already taken place. The room no longer belonged to Olivia's version of authority. It had moved, quietly but completely, into something else, something grounded in fact rather than assumption. I could feel it in the way people stood now, in the way they watched, no longer waiting for direction but for clarity. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to stand fully within that space, not as someone overlooked or dismissed, but as someone who had never actually stepped away at all. The shift in the room became undeniable after that, not because anyone announced it, but because no one was looking at Olivia anymore for direction, and she felt it before she could hide it. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, her posture still upright but no longer effortless, as if she were holding herself in place rather than standing naturally. The kind of confidence she had carried earlier depended on agreement, on momentum, on the quiet assumption that no one would question her authority, and now that assumption had dissolved in a way she could not easily rebuild. One of the board members, Mr. Langford, stepped forward just enough to enter the circle fully, his expression measured, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the room rather than any one person. "I believe we should clarify the current ownership structure before proceeding with any announcements regarding expansion," he said, his words deliberate, leaving no room for dismissal. A few others nodded, not dramatically, but enough to confirm that the direction of the evening had changed. Olivia let out a small breath, her lips pressing together briefly before she forced another smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes this time. "Of course," she said, though the word sounded thinner than it should have. "We can review that at a later time in a more appropriate setting." No one moved to support that suggestion. The silence that followed was not uncertain, it was expectant, and it settled heavily around her. Daniel glanced between us again, his uncertainty now fully visible. His earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension that he could no longer conceal. I watched him for a moment, not with disappointment, not even with anger, but with a kind of clarity that comes when you finally see someone without the weight of who you believe they were. Harrison stepped slightly to the side, creating space rather than filling it, and that small gesture made it clear that what happened next belonged to me alone. I did not rush. I did not raise my voice. I simply spoke when the room was ready to listen. "There will be no later time," I said, my tone even, leaving no room for negotiation. "Because any decision made tonight requires the consent of the majority shareholder." The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. Mr. Langford inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, while another board member, Miss Patel, spoke up with quiet certainty. "That is correct," she said, her voice steady. "Any formal agreement would require that approval." Olivia's composure faltered then in a way that could not be disguised, her gaze shifting quickly, calculating, searching for something that was no longer there. "This is highly irregular," she said, though the authority she attempted to project no longer aligned with the reality of the room. I held her gaze without hesitation, my expression unchanged. "No," he replied calmly. "What is irregular is assuming control without verifying it." The distinction settled heavily, and I could see it land, not just with her, but with everyone present. Daniel took another step forward, closer this time, his voice quieter when he spoke. "Mom, why did you never say anything?" I let the question sit for a moment, not because I needed time to answer, but because he needed time to understand the weight of what he was asking. "Because it was never necessary," I said finally. "Until now." Around us the room remained still, but it was no longer uncertain. It was aligned, grounded in something far more stable than perception or presentation. Olivia stood at the center of it, but the space no longer belonged to her, and she knew it. The narrative she had built, the authority she had assumed, had not been taken from her in a dramatic moment. It had simply been revealed for what it was: incomplete, unsupported, and now impossible to maintain. I did not move closer. I did not need to. The distance between us had already been defined in a way that no words could undo, and as I stood there, calm and steady, I understood that the final step was not about proving anything further. It was about deciding what came next. The silence that followed was not fragile anymore. It was settled, anchored in a truth that no one in the room could ignore, and I could see it in the way people stood, in the way their attention no longer shifted between voices but remained fixed, steady, waiting for what I would say next. Olivia did not speak again immediately, and that, more than anything else, confirmed what had already changed, because she had always been quick to fill a silence, to redirect it, to reshape it into something that served her. Now she stood still, her expression composed but distant, as if recalculating every assumption she had made about the space she occupied. Daniel remained where he was, close enough to me to speak, but not close enough to reach, his posture uncertain in a way I had never seen before, and for a moment I wondered if he understood what had just happened, not in terms of documents or authority, but in terms of distance, of what had quietly been lost long before tonight. I let the moment hold just a little longer, not out of hesitation, but because some things deserve to settle completely before they are finished. Then I spoke, not loudly, not with emphasis, just clearly enough that there could be no confusion. "There will be no expansion agreement signed this evening," I said, my voice even, measured, final. A few of the board members nodded immediately, their agreement not dramatic, but firm, grounded in the understanding that had been restored to the room. Harrison did not need to speak again. His presence alone was enough. Olivia inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just slightly before she exhaled, the controlled breath of someone trying to maintain composure in a situation that no longer responded to control. "You are making a mistake," she said, her tone quieter now, no longer directed at the room but at me. I met her gaze without any change in expression. "No," he replied calmly. "I am correcting one." The distinction was simple, but it carried everything that needed to be said. Daniel's voice came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. "What happens now?" he asked. I turned to him fully then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "Now," I said, "we proceed the way your father intended, with transparency, with accountability, and with the proper authority in place." He nodded slightly, though it was clear he was still trying to understand what that meant for him, for the version of the future he had been standing inside just moments before. Around us the room began to shift again, but this time it was not tension, it was movement, quiet conversations resuming, but with a different tone, more grounded, more deliberate, as if everyone present had adjusted to a new center of gravity. I reached for my bag and closed it carefully, the soft click of the clasp marking the end of something that had stretched far longer than it should have. I did not look back at Olivia again. I did not need to see her reaction to understand it. Some realizations do not require witnesses. They simply exist, undeniable and complete. I took a step away from the center of the room, then another, the space opening naturally as people shifted to let me pass, not out of obligation but out of recognition. Near the exit I paused briefly, not to make a statement, not to draw attention, but simply because it felt appropriate to acknowledge the moment for what it was. For years I had allowed myself to be seen as something smaller, something easier to dismiss,